midterm elections, and so many things that are happening within the industry today. Really looking forward to getting their perspectives. So just as an introduction, Dynamo Energy Hub is a unique kind of membership model where the members of our ecosystem and community are movers and shakers of the energy transition. They're companies of all sizes, they're corporations, NGOs, governments, investors, as well as startup companies, all who are bringing something to the table. And what Dynamo Energy does is we bring them together through networking events, thought leadership events like this one and others that we have, great partnerships, and of course, spaces that we can share for co-working events and meetings in key cities around the world. I'm happy to announce that we are also officially international. We just launched our first hub, and we're getting started with London, and we have more to come. So we have 8 hubs now across the US and now in London. So it's our pleasure to introduce to you today the Roaring 20s, which is going to take a look at some of the legislation that has been passed over the last 3 years and seeing what this might foretell in the future, the impacts that we've had so far and what's coming up next. So first, what I'd like to do is introduce our speakers. First up, I'm going to introduce both Jeremy, who's going to give you a presentation about his perspectives, and then Kyle, of course, will give his presentation, and then we can do some audience Q&A. So with that, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us today from DC. Jeremy's the Chief Strategy Officer at ClearPath, where he leads the development, management, and execution of the organization's strategic plan. And in that role, he oversees their public policy development, government affairs, strategic partnerships, research, and including philanthropic initiatives. He's got a broad experience that he brings to this role at ClearPath. He also serves as a member of the U.S. Department of Commerce's Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Advisory Committee and plays a leadership role in multiple clean energy advisory trade groups, serving as the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council, a leading advocate for American nuclear energy technologies, and legislative chair for Geothermal Rising, the largest association for geothermal energy professionals. As you can see today, he's a frequent commentator on clean energy innovation, export financing, regulatory reforms, and many things that accelerate the development of cutting-edge technologies. We're very happy to have him, as he is also featured frequently in publications such as the Washington Post, Politico, Bloomberg, GreenBiz, among others. So thank you so much for joining us today, Jeremy. Kyle, I'm going to introduce you next, but first we're going to hear from Jeremy. So why don't I turn it over to you, Jeremy, and you can give us a bit of your perspective on what's happening with this legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kristen, for the kind introduction, and thanks to Dynamo for putting on this great event. I mean, I think particularly timely, given we're weeks away from the election, and a lot of folks are thinking about what's next in the clean energy and climate space. As Kristen mentioned, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at ClearPath. For those of you unfamiliar with ClearPath, we're a DC-based non-government organization, a research and policy organization that's focused on policies that accelerate breakthrough innovations that reduce global emissions in the energy and the industrial sectors. And so I oversee kind of the full DC gamut of responsibilities there, the government affairs, the policymaker education, and kind of strategic partnerships moving forward. And so I spent a lot of time in DC focused on these type of issues. And I think, right out the gate, I'd like to underscore, it's been crazy times in Washington, D.C. Over the last 3 years, we've seen significant legislation get enacted into law that in each juncture was the biggest climate and clean energy bill to get enacted into law since really the 2005 Energy Act. And this really concentration of work, much that was bipartisan, is really an important piece of what sets the stage for the next decade as clean energy moves forward and the energy transformation progresses. I want to maybe start with a little recap of that, because I feel like the media, if you're reading media, you're reading a lot about the IRA, which is probably the worst acronym possible for an energy and climate bill. But really dating back to the end of the Trump administration in bipartisan work in Congress, that really was over the course of 4 or 5 years, a bunch of things have come together. First was the Energy Act, which was that kind of December at the end of the previous administration, which really was the combination of 5 years of work in the energy committees in Congress to realign the Department of Energy around the challenge of climate and clean energy. And so it authorized a bunch of big moonshot technology demonstration programs, gave key program direction to the department that they wanted to structure, enhanced a bunch of energy efficiency programs that I know a lot of folks try to utilize, and even had the phase down of HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, that are used in items like air conditioners and refrigerators, that had really significant climate impact. And folks really lauded the successes of that bill, given the interesting divided political government. And then we moved into this most recent Congress, which was a very narrow Democratic House, Democratic Senate, and Democratic administration. And we saw two big bills get across the finish line with strong bipartisan support. The first being the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or many people call the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, that injected $62 billion of resources into the Department of Energy to make good on the Energy Act, frankly. The Energy Act put the framework in place to accelerate technological innovation. The infrastructure bill funded that and provided financial certainty over the next 5 years to ensure that the DOE could follow through on those programs and ultimately catalyze big development. And what I think was a really key component of this was the 5 years worth of funding. And two, there were strategic investments that were made that were aimed to catalyze regional energy innovation approaches. So there was $8 billion given to hydrogen hubs, $3.5 billion given to CO2 removal hubs, to build out infrastructure, to build out carbon storage, things along those lines. And so it really was a big focus of how does the department form public-private partnerships to catalyze investment that lift significant investments in regions across the U.S. to have all these technologies take off. Roughly a year later, a big China competitiveness bill got across the finish line. It had been worked on for a year. It ultimately was called the CHIPS Act. I think they really failed in their ability to call this the Chips and Salsa Act, potentially, because there was a bill component of it that was called SALSA, which reauthorized DOE's science bill. But we like to keep it going on that. And this bill kind of doubled down on this approach of U.S. industrial policy, right? So how does the government partner with the private sector to bring these new technologies forward? And a couple things that I think were really important. Obviously, the investments in the U.S. semiconductor industry, and that was something that really got the biggest attention. But there was a big focus on heavy industry decarbonization, resources given to accelerate nuclear development at sites like existing power plant sites, and really a focus to try to drive new DOE activities in the science and research space to move forward. And then last but not least, a couple months ago, we saw the Democratic Reconciliation Bill, the only of these four that wasn't bipartisan, enacted into law, which effectively established almost $750 billion of incentives and direct funding in these technology areas that, I think the thing to underscore there was tax incentives for the next 10 years. I think all of the ones who have been project developers in recent years, and I worked for a tax writing committee member when I was in Congress. We went on 2-year spurts here, right? Sometimes they were even retroactive. And so the codification of 10 years worth of financial incentives kind of combines to provide some certainty to drive private sector investment moving forward. But each of these four bills are really significant packages, 3 of them bipartisan, strong bipartisan support, and really have been the culmination of big work that the committees have done over many years to see it come to fruition. And I think it's important to focus less on the individual bills and now think about like the broader policy landscape that presents for clean tech and how we move forward with an energy transformation. I did want to give you this kind of chart just to really underscore the unprecedented nature of that big $62 billion package of direct DOE funding, so appropriate federal taxpayer dollars given DOE to these public-private partnerships. You'll see this line on 2021. I mean, exponentially higher than even back to 2009 when the stimulus bill moved about, which folks often talked about. And this was done on a bipartisan manner and effectively represented doubling the DOE energy R&D budget for the next 5 years. And so the scale of it is tough to comprehend, and it presents a challenge, right? The Department of Energy has a lot of resources at hand. They've got to figure out how to spend this in an impactful way that is additive to what the private sector is doing right now, where we've also seen an influx of significant private sector investment come in, not duplicative or watering down the role of the private sector. And so the combination of all these things have dramatically changed the outlook for financial investment in clean energy as a whole. And so, I show you these charts, and this is projected by Princeton, who really has been one of the go-to modelers on energy policy over the last couple of years. And you kind of see the rapid uptick of investment and how it projects how this will impact the capital stack and the financial picture as we go into the mid 2030s. And this is the aggregate of all those bills together coming together and showing how it has an impact moving forward for hydrogen, for CO2 storage, for nuclear energy, for wind and solar, and for transmission. And so we're living in a different world than we were 4 years ago, frankly. And I think that's exciting. And I think we need to unpack what does that exactly mean. As ClearPath views it, and as I mentioned, we're a policy advocacy organization in DC. We see very simply the energy transformation looking this way. The U.S.'s role in global energy transformation is the innovation and demonstration component of the puzzle. How do we partner with the private sector to bring new technologies to the market? How do we get the government out of the way here in the U.S. to allow those technologies to deploy? How do we accelerate their deployment? And then how do we ultimately be a technology provider across the globe? How does the US export affordable, clean energy technologies to help impact the big global climate picture? And the reason I bring this up is because when you think about the policy footprint that was left as a result of these 4 bills, effectively this first bucket here, the innovate and demonstrate, and the deploy domestically, has significant federal policy that's in place for over the next decade. And so, right now, I would argue that it's now the private sector's hands to ultimately drive forward and start to build and improve these technologies out and really accelerate the efforts to deploy clean energy in this country and abroad. And, I highlight this because I think, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, that the regulatory side and the international picture are going to be two things that need significantly more policy focus, and ultimately is where I think the new Congress is going to be focusing their time moving forward. So as you look at these things kind of in aggregate, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a picture on just a couple technologies that ClearPath focuses on in particular. We spend a lot of time on technological innovation in nuclear, in energy storage, in CCUS, in geothermal, and in carbon removal. And so when you combine the 4 bills that got enacted into law over the last 3.5 years, you can see a little bit of the picture here, right? Congress has given direction to the Department of Energy of how they can structure more impactful federal public-private partnership programs. They gave them a boatload of money, and then they've codified a bunch of long-term incentives that should accelerate their deployment over the next 10 years if the government gets out of the way. And so these kind of the aggregate of these policies, as I mentioned, kind of accomplish those 2 buckets in the technology S-curve that we need to deploy and ultimately accelerate an energy transformation. I'll do a little bit of a snapshot of a couple technologies I think are relevant to the crowd here. Happy to talk more about other areas too, but the hydrogen area is one where I think it's really crazy how things have developed. Very little federal policy in hydrogen 4 years ago. I mean, I've been out of government for a little over 5 years. No one was talking about hydrogen when I left, and I worked on the energy committees and on the tax committees in the Senate. Now, as a result of these 4 big bills, we've seen really a significant focus directed to the Department of Energy on how they could scale these technologies. $8 billion to create these hydrogen hubs, and an array of other resources put together that kind of are meant to amplify those. And then ultimately a huge production in an investment tax credit to try to deploy hydrogen technologies. And so none of this was available in federal support over the last 3.5 years. And so I think it's a real recognition that hydrogen is going to play a significant role in global decarbonization across sectors of the economy. And the U.S. has a significant role and maybe even a strategic advantage as we look over into the next decade and building out those technologies, and the U.S. being a producer of clean hydrogen. This slide gives you a little more information on the tax incentive. This is one area where this is completely brand new. In the big bill that got done, in the reconciliation bill, some credits that had long bipartisan support had been enacted into law and other packages dating back to a decade, or dating back, frankly, to the Energy Act of 2005. Have gotten tweaked, like the 45Q tax credit for CCUS, for example, has existed for a long time. Congress, on a bipartisan manner, has extended and enhanced that incentive twice in the last 5 years. They then extended it again and increased the value in this most recent bill. In the hydrogen space, this was brand new, and so I thought it was worth flagging a little bit that Congress saw the value of creating a new investment in production credit for clean hydrogen. The credit does ramp up and down based off the carbon intensity of the production of the hydrogen, and so I think it's something that a lot of folks are taking a look at, and happy to unpack this more if folks want to talk about it in the Q&A. The one technology that I would argue has maybe benefited the most from this influx of policy over the last couple of years is nuclear. We've seen billions of dollars given to the demonstration of new advanced nuclear technologies, strong direction to the DOE that they see it both as a climate and a national security imperative that we bring new technologies to the market, and then tax incentives both to support existing nuclear and new nuclear as we move forward. And then, in the energy storage space, probably maybe the technology that has the most bipartisan support in Congress behind nuclear. We've seen big investments made, both in public-private partnerships, user facilities, and the lab infrastructure, and then now its own investment tax credit that make it eligible for a significant investment tax credit outside of projects jointly with solar and wind moving forward. And then as we think about power sector decarbonization, there's a new incentive in place for all zero emission power sector technologies that frankly have more glide path even longer than a decade. So this clean electricity production credit and the clean electricity investment credit, which could give up to a 2.5 cent per kilowatt hour production credit, or upwards of a 50% ITC if you're able to build them in the right communities and have the right labor agreements and things in place. This credit could go well into the 2030s because it's also tied to sector emission goals. And so maybe I'm a pessimist on this. I think we're going to make significant progress towards domestic emissions reductions over the next decade, but some of the big goals they set here I think is unlikely, especially if Congress doesn't do big permitting reform. So that's a lot about what just happened over the last 4 years. I want to touch just very briefly before I turn to Kyle of what we expect in this new Congress, because the question that I get the most is, all right, all this stuff got done over the last couple of years. Is it all going to get blown up in the next Congress? Is it actually here in the long term? And what is Congress actually going to focus on? I think one area where it's clear that Congress needs to focus is in the permitting space, and it's become clear that just if we are going to make good on any of the goals that government and private sector is setting for decarbonization moving forward, we've got to get the government out of the way. It's the new blocker, and it's unprecedented amount of development that we need in this country across technologies. And so the status quo is simply untenable. And you can kind of see in this chart, like it's staggering to see how much steel we need to put in the ground over the next decade to hit any of these objectives. There's going to be a big focus in heavy industry. Congress is really interested in supply chain issues, and in these big bills that did get enacted, and the law started to touch it. I would say that the big picture in the power sector is in a good place for the coming years. I think more policy is going to be needed in the industrial space. I think it's where there could be really strong political alignment among Republicans and Democrats. And then, a lot of folks are asking me, what does a Republican House majority look like? I don't want to get too much into forecasting, but I would say I'm putting my money in Vegas on Republicans taking the House in a couple weeks. And what does that look like? Well, I think the one important thing to flag is in DC, a lot of these policies ultimately were enacted on a bipartisan basis. And even some of the tax incentives that got done in the Democratic reconciliation bill had been or were in the place that they were because bipartisan action had happened over recent years to establish them. And then even House Republicans have put forth an aggressive energy and climate strategy moving forward, focused on accelerating innovation, unlocking American resources, exporting technologies, competing with China and Russia, which I think is a real important driver. The national security narrative really resonates with Republicans. And so we're having a debate in Washington, D.C. about how we should tackle climate, not whether we should tackle climate. And that's really been central to these public policy successes, and I think is going to be really critical as we move forward on what we're expecting over the next couple of years. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm happy to answer a bunch of questions, and I'll turn it back over to Kristen. You're on mute, Kristen.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was terrific to hear an overview of what's been going on the last 4 years. As you say, it's been crazy, and we may have missed a few opportunities on naming some of these bills, but what can you do about that? However, I do think it's very informative to see what might happen in the future. So why don't we take a look at, Kyle, your perspective. Before you get going with your notes and commentary, I wanted to just give a brief introduction. Kyle Hayes is special counsel in the Global Projects Department of Baker Botts and also serves as an advisor for Dynamo Energy Hub. His practice focuses on project development and M&A at both the corporate and the project levels, across a broad array of renewable energy assets and different technologies. Kyle's sponsor side representation has included that of large private equity firms, investment banks, renewable developers, utilities, as well as Fortune 100 companies. And he also provides strategic, commercial, and legal advice to clients on transactions that involve different types of renewables, including solar, wind, battery storage, carbon capture, waste to energy, and other types of renewable fuels, principally RNG and sustainable aviation fuel. But prior to his entering private practice with Baker Botts, he served as in-house counsel to Con Edison of New York, my alma mater, actually, and where he handled various commercial and transactional and regulatory matters related to wholesale and retail energy markets. He began his legal career at FERC. So bringing you right back to DC, where you are seated today. And we thank you very much for your time and expertise. I'm going to hand it over to you to begin your presentation and commentary. Thanks so much, Kyle.
All right, thanks, Kristen. I appreciate the warm introduction there. Let me get my slides going here. Everybody see that? Okay, hope so. So as Kristen mentioned, I'm Kyle Hayes, special counsel at Baker Botts. We're a global law firm. We are heavily known for our energy expertise. We historically have had a lot of what I'll call traditional or fossil fuel based representation, but we also have a lot of native renewable energy clients, and as a result of our history, we sit very much at the forefront of the transition space in terms of a lot of the decarbonization technologies that some of which Jeremy just highlighted. And so, I'm going to likely focus a lot more on the IRA and try to kind of hit some critical points in terms of how this actually plays out, because on the legal front, we're actually seeing this day to day in terms of implementation and project agreements and that kind of thing. And also very closely monitoring the IRS guidance that is going to be forthcoming, and the comments that are being submitted on that front, because that's really going to be the crux of the implementation of the IRA. The legislation has come up, but the regulations are going to be even more important. So to kind of piggyback a bit on Jeremy's notes, talking about the energy transition, and I know that many of us hear this this mantra thrown around, but what does it actually mean? And I think one of the big distinctions is that, particularly for the investment community, is that these are projects tend to be with higher risk, given the fact that they have higher technology risk, but are also coupled with the fact that there are creditworthy counterparties. And so as a result, in addition to the fact that the investment community and the private equity community is willing to take more development risk these days, and so what that's doing is presenting a paradigm of higher returns, but also that's galvanized by the assistance of the economics, given some of the tax-based incentives. And so things like the Infrastructure Act and the IRA, the Infrastructure Act in particular, providing funding on the EV charging side, that's obviously of particular interest to both the development side and the financiers. And so, I think that the IRA is just making those economics even better. We've seen situations where, we have clients that have, acquired certain assets prior to the IRA being passed, and had already sort of gotten to what they thought were good economics, and now those economics have provided, effectively nothing but upside at this point. So we're certainly trending in the right direction in terms of these projects getting built. I'll talk about the fact that I think we're actually in a really interesting moment in terms of, what the IRA actually is. I think people will look back in history and realize this is quite a landmark moment. So, it's important to point out that 0 Republicans voted for the IRA in either the House or the Senate. And so this was a legislation that was really written to effectively appease Joe Manchin. And we'll talk about how some of the prevailing wage requirements and that kind of thing really fold into that concept. But it's also the case that the tax code has never really before been used as an incentive for job creation. And it's interesting, the IRA is this interesting amalgamation of climate change policy, but also it's tagged with the need to create jobs as a result, which was really the political compromise and really the crux of it. And so I think looking back years from now, folks will look back and say, wow, that was a scenario where Congress got quite creative in terms of the ability to get climate change across the line. And so, I think that it is very much a brave new world in the sense that, prior to some of the concepts around transferability and direct pay, the tax equity market for financing of renewable projects was, it was very much understand that you had these kind of blessed tax equity structures of the tax equity investor, and developers not really having the tax appetite or ability to really monetize these credits. And now, there's a much more open universe in terms of being able to take the credit, being able to transfer the credit, be a transferee of the credit. So it really broadens the universe of monetization. I think the other benefit is that, prior to this being passed, you had a receding tax credit in terms of, say, the ITC, and it was always at the end of each year, it was sort of understood that you were going down from 30 to 26, 22, and so on and so forth. And so there was always kind of this scramble around, and certainly at the end of 2020, in terms of was the ITC going to be extended, and and ultimately it was, and so we all kind of had a breath of fresh air there. And so now this is adding a lot more certainty, albeit that there is the need to step up in terms of getting back to, say, the 30% ITC credit. We'll talk about that in a second. With the expansion of the DOE loan program, I think, I was at a conference not too long ago with DOE officials, and one of the things that they stated that was quite meaningful was that they feel like it's their duty to help sponsors attract private capital. And so, to that extent, they, are positioning themselves to basically help, sort of alleviate a lot of the technology risk and market risks around these newer technologies, and really help sponsors get on their feet. And so I think with that attitude, particularly given the fact that some of these technologies are beneficial to things like CCUS, and some of those technologies that are more favorable to some in red states, I think that's likely to continue in terms of DOE having a positive outlook in terms of attracting, helping sponsors attract private capital. Talking about the IRA itself, so it used to be, right, as I described, you had this declining tax credit amount, and now what it's actually sort of the opposite, right? So instead of a sort of a increased, instead of a sort of consistent step down, you now have a base credit. Say, for when I'm using the ITC as an example, you have a base credit that's much smaller. So you have a 6% base credit, and in order to get back up to that 30%, you've got to satisfy prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. Well, why is that, right? And really, what it comes down to is jobs. The idea was that if you're going to continue to have this this boon to monetization, then there has to be, right, some other sort of domestic benefit. And ultimately that came in the form of these prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, which, by the way, apply to, they certainly will apply to contractors. So certainly your EPC contractors, and will also apply to things like alteration and repairs, although there is a carve out for O&M. And so, I was on a call with an EPC contractor the other day, and they were sort of frightened by this entire situation because, it actually, one of the interesting things about the IRA is that it's actually potentially moving more risk onto the counterparties in project development, specifically your EPC contractors and potentially things like module suppliers and that kind of thing. And so it's quite a new moment, but that is very much all up in the air right now. We're all sort of scrambling to figure out what and how we're going to structure this, and sort of building on that, things like change in law risk. The change in law risk, is something that sponsors historically were used to, kind of having to acknowledge and not really have too much leverage there. I think what you could potentially end up seeing with some of the prevailing wage requirements, and we'll talk about some of the credit bonuses as well in terms of domestic content and that kind of thing, you can end up seeing that risk being basically being moved over to some of the contractor and supplier side, which is quite new. Along those same lines, there is an exemption for compliance with all of these rules if a project begins construction before 60 days after IRS guidance is issued. There's a fairly consistent view that IRS guidance will not be issued until probably Q1 of next year. And so there's this sort of, perhaps 6 to 7 month window of sponsors to get projects commencing construction, which, depending on what your safe harbor strategy is, it may very well be viable, but maybe not. And so that is sort of one other key piece that we're looking at as we're trying to figure out what should go into project level agreements that need to be executed prior to IRS guidance being issued. The bonuses, I do want to pause on this for 1 second, and just to kind of get back to some of the political aspects of this. So the domestic content rules have to do with the equipment parts of a project being a part of a U.S. manufacturing process, but also that the components be of U.S. origin. I can tell you that negotiating solar module supply agreements has become a much more comprehensive exercise than it used to be, given the fact that now you have OEMs that are quite hesitant to sign up for good faith covenants to ultimately make sure their equipment supply, to the extent that they are U.S. based, is of U.S. origin, and the manufacturing process is U.S. based. We're trying to get O&Ms to commit to that, but they are relatively reluctant in the absence of IRS guidance. So we're kind of in a bit of purgatory right now, if you will. And then the energy communities piece, you may have heard a lot about this particular aspect of things, and what it really comes down to is there's a very prescriptive set of rules that say that if you ultimately are building a project in a quote energy community, that there's another 10% adder to say for the ITC, each of the domestic content and the energy communities bonuses are each 10%. So if you were to satisfy both, you could get up to 50%. The rules around the energy communities is really meant to describe, wink, wink, places like West Virginia, where there's rules about it being where an old coal plant is. There's rules about it being a brownfield facility under CERCLA. There's rules about the ultimate wage and sort of poverty line associated with those communities. And it's meant to capture, right, places like West Virginia, other, sort of Rust Belt states where, the implementation of the IRA and implementation of renewable climate change could end up, potentially displacing people from working at coal plants and that kind of thing. So this was written very much to appease Manchin and folks of similar mind of Manchin to get it across. And so if you're ever wondering sort of how did that prescriptive nature come up of say for energy communities, you don't really have to guess too hard. What are some of the new technologies that are added for PTC and ITC availability? So clean hydrogen, which to the pleasure of many in the renewable fuel space, includes both green and blue hydrogen. So it was somewhat neutral definition in terms of satisfying that. One of the other things that I think is really, really emerging is biogas. And so now you have biogas eligible for the ITC up to 30% or 50% with the bonuses. You guys may have seen there's been a lot of biogas M&A recently. We here at the firm have been part of some of that in terms of the Sim Group and Mass Energy acquisition, but also BP recently bought Archaea. There's just been a lot of movement in that area, and I think with the ITC added, that makes the economics that much better. So that's something to certainly keep your eye on. EVs. There's now the ability. There's now tax incentives for EVs for domestic, both in terms of batteries, but also for the battery components in terms of them being domestically manufactured. And so one of the things that we get a lot of questions about is around the credit stacking. And, can you pair a, ITC for, say solar with a PTC for clean hydrogen? The answer is largely yes, right? And I think it's only in furtherance, right, of creating multiple revenue streams and therefore, making these projects even more financeable. I'll skip over the PTC versus ITC election. The only thing I'll say about that is, historically, the PTC was used in a situation where you had a lower cost build and higher production factor, which given, the evolution of solar optimization now, being able to use the PTC, say for an extremely large utility scale solar project that has a lot of high output and is also, has good economics in terms of the build out, the PTC could end up making sense in that situation. And so, that was something that developers and also, tax equity was interested in seeing the evolution of, and now it's present. We'll talk about this, but in terms of direct pay and transferability, these are two, I think, in terms of the sort of structure of financing projects are the two biggest boons that way. So direct pay is actually primarily applicable to tax exempt entities, but for 45Q and also for 45V, so for hydrogen and CCUS, direct pay is available, and it effectively is, the way that it sounds, is a direct cash payment, sort of irrespective of tax liability. And then transferability, the ability to actually receive a credit and then transfer it, which under previous IRS rules was seen as a big no-no, and now that is very much on the table. One of the biggest questions, though, with both of those principles is the ability to monetize depreciation, which under a typical tax equity structure was seen as an additional benefit, besides just being able to receive the tax credit. It's not necessarily clear without IRS guidance how monetizing depreciation might be baked into those two concepts. And so there's an idea for now that your typical tax equity structure would still be alive, and that sort of ties into the next slide here. There's going to be, frankly, we're just really in no man's land right now until we get more guidance. But I think the view is that there are situations where a typical tax equity structure could still be viable. I think one of the things that has not changed is the fear of IRS recapture, which was the source of a lot of indemnification provisions and different protections that were built into tax equity docs and that kind of thing. I think for example, with the transferability aspect or the transferability concept now, there's a large question as to who owns the recapture risk, and that's going to be something that the entire renewable industry is going to be asking about. If it ultimately, if there's a belief that the recapture risk could fall on the transferee, and therefore, your credits that are being transferred are probably going to be discounted to sort of account for the recapture risk, and or delays in the transfer of the credits, that kind of thing. There's speculation around the credits being traded at really 92 to 95 cents instead of $1. So there's just a lot of speculation out there, and I think everybody will be much happier once we get a little clarity from Treasury. So one important thing to note is that the legislation specifically calls out that there's no prohibition on the ability to generate revenue from existing environmental attributes. And I think that goes again to the point of there seems to be an acknowledgement that multiple revenue streams, just the ability to sell power as a standalone revenue stream is not necessarily sufficient, given some of the returns that folks are looking for. And so I think this was, while this wasn't necessarily a landmark sort of affirmative statement necessarily in the legislation, I think it was really, really meaningful, because it was effectively an acknowledgement that, hey, we know these other revenue streams are out there, but we're not trying to preclude those. This isn't sort of a zero-sum game where we're giving the ability to try to monetize through the tax code, but then we're also acknowledging at the state level, you have various environmental attribute programs that you want to take advantage of, the LCFS for renewable fuels, that kind of thing. So, I think that's in furtherance of, what seems to be, a optimistic landscape for renewables. Just kind of finishing out here, Treasury guidance again is going to be really, really key. I think the sentiment so far is that the IRS has been very welcoming to the industry. The first round of comments for IRS guidance is, I believe the deadline is on Friday at November 4th. There's supposed to be new notices put out for, I think specifically for 45Z and 45B. I don't know if those have actually gone out yet, but in any case, the IRS has said, even if comments are submitted after the deadline, it'll still be considered, right? So I think there's a sentiment of, hey, we really want to help out in terms of helping you guys make sure that you're interpreting things correctly. I think the upshot of the legislation is there's a signal for U.S. manufacturing. I think one place you see that, one place folks would probably like to see that the most, right, is in solar panel manufacturing. Right now, there is a very, very dominant solar panel manufacturer who shall remain nameless on this webinar. And I think folks would like to see a lot of diversification in that market. And so, I think some of the domestic content provisions, and some of the other advanced manufacturing provisions that provide tax incentives will hopefully help to send those price signals. Renewable fuels, again, I think the RNG market is not set to explode. I think it's already exploding. And I think, the biogas ITC certainly helps with some of the sort of baseline economics for RNG around different types of feedstock. And then, finally, important to stay in touch with advisors. This is a multidisciplinary legislation, right? There's a tax component, there's a finance component, there's a project development component. And so, we're all sort of in the mix here together, trying to figure it out kind of in the mixing pot. And so, you really do need a multifaceted approach. And, it's, last thing I'll say is just a fun time. It's just a really, really fun time in the industry. And I think, probably the most fun I've had in my career in terms of, the intellectual stimulation of trying to, wrap our hands around all of these things as we're doing deals every day. So with that, I'll kick it back to Kristen for hopefully some good Q&A.
Yeah, great. Kyle, thank you so much. This was very helpful. And I think what we'll be doing now is we can put it back to the three of us in answering a few questions here that we have received. We have several questions. We've got about 10 minutes to answer them. So I'll ask to keep the answers as brief as possible so we can get through a bunch. One of the first ones that seems to be coming up a lot is what's going to happen with the election in terms of what if there's a Republican majority? And so Jeremy, I think maybe could you tackle that first?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question and something I get asked pretty regularly coming down the pike here. The first thing that I'll throw out there at the onset is all of these policies have some root, or a good chunk of these policies, I'll say, not all of them, but the majority of them have root in some type of bipartisan support. The tax incentives have existed for a long time in many cases, some of the new stuff, and then the other three bills I talked about that are important pieces of the puzzle were all done with strong bipartisan support in Congress. And with that said, I think even regardless of what happens in the House, the Senate's going to be narrow one way or another. There's not going to be 60 votes in the House and the Senate. I think the worst on the forecasts are 53-47 either way. And so bipartisanship is going to be essential in either scenario. I would say it's highly like Republicans are taking the House. I think they're going to focus on oversight, and I think that's actually a good thing. I think the DOE needs the fire lit under them a little bit, and I think that will ensure these resources are spent well, and that oversight is ultimately going to be constructive. And outright repeal bills, outright rescission bills can't pass in a split Congress or a narrow Congress. And so I think you're going to see Republicans in Congress focus on good implementation of these things, on permitting reform and streamlining regulations to deploy it. I think they're going to be looking at how do we ensure the technologies are treated fairly, and the Congress and that the agencies are following the statute. For example, I mean, there have already been efforts to try to limit access to the hydrogen incentives, for example, based off carbon intensity. I think those are the type of things that the Republicans are going to be focused on to make sure that these things are done right and ultimately catalyzes the industry.
Yep. Yeah, great. A couple other questions as we're seeing them file in here is, do you either of you have suggestions on great resources of information where we can look for market signals? I think market signals is probably a broad term, but maybe you can just give a couple thoughts.
Us.
Layup. Yeah, we've got ClearPath and Baker Bots here who are experts. So I think this is a great way for us to enable our ecosystems experts to be able to weigh in on what's happening here and look at what's going on with market trends so we can see what's happening with policy developments, et cetera. So yeah, I think Kyle, thanks for that. Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, yeah, and I would say, one of the things that we do regularly is we just kind of have informal chats with folks, and I think from our perspective, this is such a new area that we're willing to get into the trenches with folks and help whoever figure it out. So it's not like we require an engagement letter to pick up the phone. We consider ourselves market advisors. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. I think also the trade press tends to be pretty good about sort of covering what's actually happening in the market in terms of both legislation and also deals. So that's another resource.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I would underscore is be careful about some of the noise. There is an incentive to paint a more dire picture on things. I think you need to, and I'm not necessarily saying kick them, though the Baker Bots folks are awesome and you should go to the Baker Bots folks. So, listen to the folks who are experts in the government field and such, right? Just because some random House member introduced a bill to repeal all this stuff doesn't mean that it's getting enacted into law, right? And so you need to rely on the people who are engaged in this space. We're also happy to be resources. In the traditional media, I'd say folks like Punchbowl, for example, that do coverage of the space, really inject political reality into some of these conversations. So they've got a newsletter and a podcast. Axios Generate. Some of those folks who are focused in this space track these things well, and really keep an eye out for the folks who focus on the political reality, because it's easy to get caught up in some of the stuff like, oh, random member is doing X or Y. That doesn't mean it's going anywhere.
Yeah, that's excellent point. Actually, that's partly why we are so excited about having you all as part of our Dynamo network, because there is a lot of froth out there. There's a lot of noise. So being able to weed through and find out where the experts are is really valuable. A couple other questions coming up really quickly. Thoughts on where the IRS staff is going to come up with some of the expertise in order to discern what's happening with investment risk here. Any thoughts on where that might be going? It might be a big question to answer right now, but any thoughts on where that's going, or has there been some chatter?
I think Kyle is exactly right to be focused on these Treasury or the RFIs and the requests for information. They are essential. I think they are actively seeking out industry feedback. And so folks should be engaged on it. Ideally, if you're not late, but the deadline is on Friday. But they have forecasted they're not going to extend the deadline, and they still want to hear from folks. So I think that's really important. They're relying on DOE a lot, and the engineers and the technology folks as well to kind of structure these things. I think the IRS is eyes wide open that they're not technology experts, and a lot of the qualifications for these credits are tied to engineering, right? And yeah. So I think they're going to rely on outside stakeholders. I mean, in the end, they have political interest in ensuring these are successful, right? So they want credits that folks can utilize. What do you think, Kyle?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think people should be careful to realize that this whole IRS hiring frenzy, 87,000 IRS agents being hired, are those folks going to be, investment professionals? Probably not. And so, I think Jeremy's right. I think they are going to rely a lot on industry, which I think is good. It's best to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. So I agree with that sentiment. I don't think that there will be any sort of shift towards the IRS trying to, hire, particularly specialized talent. I think for purposes of sort of their general day jobs, they're trying to cover that off first. So I think reliance on DOE, particularly on the operational aspect, will be really important as well.
Yeah, good points. Couple other questions. Kyle, where do you think that there's going to be other winners with the IRA in terms of project development or investment? And further follow up to that, how are we thinking about transmission? Lots and lots of resources out there. How do we keep it not bottled? And that's actually open to both of you.
Sure. On the first point, I'll say that, I think I mentioned early on in the presentation that I think developers are definitely the biggest winners here, given the fact that, particularly on the financing side, because it used to be the fact that you kind of, for tax equity, you really had to bring in a third party, right? And I think that's something that developers are to the extent that they can, are looking forward to being able to avoid. But also the fact that, because you have some of these prevailing wage requirements, because you now have, if you're getting US solar panels, there's these requirements about, domestically sourced manufacturing processes. I think, again, as developers, because you're able to do some risk shifting. Whereas, prior to the IRA, developers were assuming a lot of the risk for, in trying to get representations from EPC contractors and equipment suppliers and all these different things. And now, the fact that some of these folks may have to directly comply, I think helps with the risk, the risk shifting aspect of things.
Yep. And just 30 seconds to go. Just wanted a little time warden.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say on the transmission, the lack of a transmission ITC, I think, is really a bit of a red herring, right? I think what needs to be solved is the regulatory process around siting transmission and getting transmission built, some of the regional rules around transmission building, right? Because I don't think.
And that's permitting, right, Jeremy?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I don't know about Kyle, but like when we were talking to utilities and project developers reconciliation bill, folks said a tax incentive would help, but no one was saying that is the long pole in the tent for transmission. Like that permitting and regulatory certainty and navigating state and local regulations is the big deterrent there.
Yeah. Well, that concludes Q&A and your commentary from before. I want to just thank everybody for attending, and especially to Jeremy and Kyle for your expertise and insights. Much more to come from Dynamo this year, and appreciate everybody's attendance and thoughts. We will be publishing the decks on our website following the event today. So please stay tuned for that. And we will we'll look forward to seeing you at more events in the future. Again, Jeremy, Kyle, thank you so much for your expertise, and thank you for everybody for joining today. Take care and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thanks, Kyle.